Levi Brackman here with Truths, Jewish Wisdom for Today. As you can see from my background, I am not at home. I am on vacation visiting family in the United Kingdom in London. And I'm excited to share with you this episode of the podcast. I had a conversation with Rabbi Professor Michael Broyde, who is a law professor and an academic director of law and religion at Emory University. He's also a senior fellow in the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. His primary areas of interest are law and religion, Jewish law and Jewish ethics, and comparative religious law. Rabbi Broyde has published 200 articles on various aspects of law and religion and Jewish law, and a number of articles in the areas of federal courts. This conversation I had with Rabbi Broyde I consider to be really important for anyone who practices Halakha, or Jewish law. And if you're an Orthodox Jew, you're probably practicing Halakha. We discussed innovation in Jewish law. We discussed leniencies and stringencies. We discussed the role of women, women's study of Torah. We discussed tzniut, or the idea of modesty, and how people should dress, and the laws of modesty. We discussed principles that are mutable and those which are immutable, and how Jewish law evolves and the various influences on Jewish law, from rationalistic to nationalistic to mystical. We discussed Chalav Yisrael and innovations with regards to the abilities to drink milk, which has not been supervised. And in the end, Rabbi Broyde talks about how it's important to pick the rabbi that best aligns with who you are. This was a wide-ranging conversation and really interesting, and anyone who studies Jewish law, anyone who practices Jewish law, should know and be aware of this particular thinker. He was also on the Beth Din of America, and tremendously deep knowledge in Jewish law and halakha, and is a posek, a Jewish decider, Jewish legal decider in his own right. I'm really excited to have had this conversation with Rabbi Broyde and delighted to present it to you today. As with all my guests, I started off asking Rabbi Broyde to describe himself in his own terms, and this is how Rabbi Broyde describes himself, and the conversation follows after that.
I'm a law professor at Emory University who's involved in workings in Halakha. I was hired by Emory to work in Jewish law. We have a very active center for the study of law and religion. And I'm the Jewish law guy in the very active center for the study of law and religion. Unlike my Israeli counterparts, who work more exclusively in Mishpat Ivri, those areas of Jewish law that are limited to things covered in a civil society, I try to confine myself only to those things covered in the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah. I perceive myself as broadly interested in every part of Jewish law, and I try to intellectually study every part of Jewish law. Along the way, I started a shul. I was the rabbi of a large young Israel in Atlanta for almost 15 years. I was the director and then a member of the Beth Din of America for almost 20 years. And now I'm just a very active writer who finds a lot of interest in trying to write about how Halacha addresses problems in the 21st century. To the extent my law students ask me for a uniting theme in everything I've written, and not just my law students, lots of people, I explain to them that I'm interested in figuring out how a very old system of religious law, Halacha, adopts to modern times, and that the uniting theme on everything I've written is something has changed, making the ancient rules less worthwhile and forcing a re-examination of both precedent and practice. That's how I describe myself. I spend a lot of time answering practical questions of halakha as well within my little community. I'm a shiloh, and that's just the way it goes.
Thank you so much for that. And it's really interesting because I sense that your focus is really very much in line with the focus of this podcast, which is Jewish wisdom for today. I think a lot of Jewish wisdom, unlike Catholicism and other kinds of religions which have catechisms and have a very much based on theology. We are very much a religion which has halacha, which is how to behave. And within that is our wisdom. Would you agree? Or in other words, like what comes through? On this podcast, we've talked a lot about Tamei HaMitzvot and what that means. So when you think about halacha, and which is very much, if you're an Orthodox Jew, that's something which guides your every action. So what comes through it besides how to behave?
I want to say something a little bit different, which is Jewish law. Judaism is almost unique as a religion because law is front and center to the faith. And that we're not the only religion with law, but we're just about the only religion where law has the commanding heights and directs everything else.
Yep.
In the Catholic tradition, there is some law, but law derives from philosophy and not the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
In other faiths, there's ethics and law, but law derives from ethics. In the Jewish tradition, law is what the economists call the commanding heights, and incompatibility with law is unacceptable to the Halakha tradition because law is the dominant intellectual force of the Jewish tradition. Not the only force,
but the
not
dominant
at all. There are other forces. There's a Kabbalistic tradition.
Mm-hmm.
There's an ethical tradition. There's a social tradition. There are a variety of secondary streams, but unlike almost any other faith, the legal tradition is the dominant tradition within Orthodox Jewish law. To a great extent, the challenge of Reform Judaism was the argument that we should Protestantize and make law derivative of ethics and not the other way around. It's not just that we change this law or change that law. It's an argument that should be derivative of ethics and not the other way around.
So last week with Don Seaman, he said, if it's just law, then it comes like a dry branch, was his use of his language, which I really appreciated that kind of language and description. And so without what he called agada, which included theology, it's just dry branch. The question is, what comes through this law? Because if you tell people you just have to practice all these things, which then that's fine, but what is the wisdom in your mind that comes through this idea that it's the dominant form is the law?
I think that Halacha has a deep skepticism of ethical ideas ungrounded from law.
Mm-hmm.
And the grounding into law creates parameters for mysticism, for ethics, for tzedakah, for chesed, all sorts of ideas that are very important that you can make primary, unless they're grounded in law, become ideas that can easily spin out of control. You're hard pressed to express to people why ethical ideas standing alone shouldn't be true. But when you ground them against law, create certain parameters and pen in ethics. And they force ethics to be subservient, not just to what we think is the good and the right, but to what the text says. And that I won't directly comment on whether halacha alone is a dry branch.
Mm-hmm.
I will say that halacha is.
I was paraphrasing him. I may have
nurtured by many other activities. And by the way, what you choose to let nurture halacha determines very much what branch of orthodoxy you are. Yep. The mystics are also halacha.
Yep. But so there's a couple of things which I find interesting here, if I may. So if you get very deep into the intricacies of the text, but you don't understand, if you like, the spirit of the text, and then the question is, could you also go astray, ending up reading the text in a way in which because you don't understand the spirit of the meaning of what it came from, that you end up with something which is way off in left field. Is that a concern? And because it seems like you have the body and the soul, if you like, the guf and the neshama. You need to have this. You have the law and then the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law in some way has to fit in with the law or not, or maybe it's just the law. I'm trying to get a feel of what you mean.
I think that there's no doubt that different streams within rabbinic Judaism infuse halakha with different others. And the others that you infuse halakha with determine your flavor. A Halakha Plus the Tanya is a very different work than the Halakha Plus the Moreh Nevuchah, which is a very different work than the Halakha Plus many other additions that have been added to Halakha over time that are not incompatible with Halakha, but which push Halakha in one direction or another. Halakha is not a point, but a box. And where within the box, both we as a community and you or me as an individual choose to reside, is very much driven by what nurtures us besides halakha. When halakha stops nurturing us, then we're no longer part of the rabbinic community. But halakha plus mysticism is a very different halakha than halakha plus rationalism, which is a very different halakha than halakha plus nationalism. And not all of the pluses, by the way, that you find in Judaism come from Judaism. That's okay too. So long as you keep...
Give an example of one which doesn't come.
I think the Broyde's criticism of the Rambam is that he drank the philosophical waters of, I think he says, Aristotle. As far as I know, Aristotle wasn't Jewish. So when the Gra said that the Rambam drank the waters of Aristotle, he means it as a criticism. But if I were to be able to channel the Rambam on this podcast, the Rambam would smile and say that's correct, because it's a truth outside of Torah that infuses into Torah. The Rambam's idea that there are truths outside of Torah that infuse into Torah doesn't bother the Rambam at all. The Gra thinks he has a killer question on the Rambam, and the Rambam doesn't even understand the question. The Rambam says, so what? Accept truth from every person. The every person that we're accepting truth from means there are true values outside of...
It's interesting because he even says that he's not going to quote. He's going to quote some text, but he won't say where they came from, because if he did, people would just discount them because they came from a source they don't agree with without thinking about the ideas contained in that.
But the Rambam's basic model says that there's halakha, and truth can be a Jewish truth. Tov shebiyefet ba'olei shem is a metaphor in the Gemara for the ideas that there are wonderful things out there that should go in our community. Those Tov shebiyefet aren't Jewish truths, but they belong ba'olei shem. You might even claim that some parts of nationalism are this way.
Some people might argue that parts of mysticism, Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah.
And no doubt some will argue that there are parts of mysticism. I've never found delving into the origins of things that are added to halakha to be useful. To me, the central question is, are they true? If they're true, then they're useful. And if they're true because a non-Jew invented them, they discovered them, but they're still true. Meaning, I occasionally discuss with people mikvah shayla. And I was just discussing
ritual immersion, right? Yes.
Ritual immersion. I was discussing with somebody construction of a mikvah. And I took out for them to explain to them why the process they were using wasn't going to work. And I did a little bit of physics with them about the weight of water and the steel rebar is needed. And they said, where did you learn that? And I said, not in my Rebbe's shiur. Okay. And they said, is that really part of the rabbinic tradition? And I said, look, here's what you need to understand. Your mikveh is going to crack and break if you do it this way. And if you do it that way, it won't crack and break, because this is the equation for figuring out how much reinforced rebar and how thick the cement is. And then I don't know if it was invented by a religious Jew, but I do know that it's widely perceived accurate by civil engineers, and you too need to follow it. I don't see determining the source of the truth to be as important as determining whether it is true.
So let's take a few steps back into the 15th century, where there was a very active Kabbalistic presence in Tzfat, and which had an impact on Halakha.
Sure.
And that impact, there were certain, would you agree there were certain changes that took place as a result of that activity that wasn't there previously? And talk a little bit about that, and then what the implications perhaps of that, or maybe you disagree.
Of course. The mystical community had enormous impact. Anybody who learns the Magen Avram sees that the Magen Avram is a regular citer of various mystical traditions, many of which have crept into Minhag Ashkenaz. I don't mean crept in any bad way. I just mean didn't enter through the Rosh or the Tur. They crept in through the Magen Avram. Sure, no doubt about that at all. And other commentaries brought in other traditions. No doubt. The mystical tradition had an impact on halakhic choices. Of course.
How would you quantify that impact?
I don't know what you mean by quantify.
In other words, compared to the impact, for example, of a more rationalist approach, Maimonidean approach.
In the 1500s and the 1600s and the 1700s, the mystical approach was more profound. A reader of Igros Moshe, well-known 20th century Jewish law authority, notices what? There are no positive citations to the Zohar. He occasionally cites the Zohar to note that we don't follow it. But there's not a single citation where he endorses the Zohar as the source of a halacha that we should follow. So I would say in the 20th century, you're more likely to find more rationalism and mysticism in the Lithuanian yeshivish community. Is it changing over time? I'm not a sociologist, but the idea that Halakha Plus, that the plus has changed over time and will continue to change over time, and it's one of the ways that Halakha incorporates currents in the world around them, is no doubt true. Is no doubt true. And not only is it no doubt true, it's no doubt good.
Is there a self-awareness, do you think, amongst the practitioners of halakha, of this Halakha Plus, the way you characterize it? Or do they just think this is the halakha?
No, I think there's an awareness among everybody that this is the case. But of course, when you say everybody, I don't mean everybody, but I think all serious Morah Horaz who answer questions that are discretionary understand that there are 3 or 4 viable answers, and they're recommending one or even advocating for one frequently because of the plus. Not always, but frequently because of the plus.
So I want to dive into the article which you very kindly presented or sent to me. Very fascinating. And in it, you mentioned, because you just mentioned Rabbi Moshe Feinstein about, for example, whether one can drink milk, which the milking was not supervised by a Jew. And you mentioned in that article about how things have changed. So in the article, you describe how innovation within halakha, but through a faithful reading of the text, one is able to reinterpret halakha so that it fits in with the contemporary way in which we live. Would that be correct?
That's a way to think about it. I think that's what poskim throughout the ages have done.
Yeah.
Since 1940, 5 great changes have come to world Jewry, which have required a re-examination of the precedents, both from Europe and Svard. And it's been an enormous change in Halacha. The first is, of course, Hakamat Medinat Yisrael.
Yes.
There's no doubt that the establishment of a Jewish homeland ruled by Jews in which a minority of the community is halachic has enormously changed halachic practice. Hilchot Milchama were for 1,000 years a dead letter, and now it's not at all a dead letter. The related challenge is the challenge of living in a democracy where we are not oppressed and we are part of the citizenry with the same rights as everybody else. For centuries, Dina de Malchus Adina was given lip service, and now it's being given more than lip service, and it's forcing us to re-examine some halachic practices, whether it's Masira or the duty to pay taxes. And then, of course, there's technology. Technology is changing lots of things. I give occasional shiurim on what I think will be the impact of AI on halachic practice. But rising changes in technology are innovating significant areas of halacha from Talmud Torah onward.
I found that actually really fascinating where you mentioned that now women need to study. You might say, which is really interesting in of itself, where they said that women don't study or shouldn't study Torah or Talmud at least, unless it's halacha l'maisa, something which they need to actually pay attention to in their lives. And you say that's really expanded.
That's right. So meaning, and the social change in the status of women. The social change in the status of women has enormously expanded not just women's Torah study, but women's everything.
So I have a question on this for you, and it's going to jump straight into the weeds for the audience. But in Taf Ayin Beis, Hilchos Pesach, the laws of Pesach, it talks about whether women need to lean at the Seder table, right? Usually men and women lean.
Sure.
And there's this kind of one line which comes from the Shiltos, which says that that all our women folk are considered important, therefore they all have to lean. So even back then, it seems that the changing status of women was something that was really seriously taken into consideration as it related to their practice.
Sure.
And I'm wondering whether you think that is something that, or that approach to women as their changing status has changed, has not been adopted enough by rabbis throughout the centuries.
I think this is very much driven by the different communities that you're in. One of the most interesting things is we have many diverse communities. It's not a community, it's communities.
Yeah.
And the status of women is less universal than technology. Satmar disagrees with me profoundly about the reestablishment of the state of Israel and disagrees with me profoundly about the status of women. But all the Satmar Hasidim I know walk around with the same state-of-the-art cell phone that I do. It's a very important idea, at least in America. In Israel, it's less. There's still technological resistance. But as far as I can tell, in America, even the Hasidim, the Haredim are committed to living a state-of-the-art high-tech life. And so I think that, of course, the status of women is a contested area within Orthodoxy exactly because the undergirded sociology is still complex. It's not unified and agreed to in ways that the undergirded technology is agreed to.
Correct. However, as you point out in your article, that a woman who today is a professional, what was the profession that you gave us an example? I don't recall, but
a radiologist,
right? So she would have to study all the halachot related to radiology, which could be vast. Now, no one's going to disagree today. That woman who's a radiologist has got a certain status in the community, which women in the 1700s never had. Just period.
Much more rarely.
Much, much, much more rare, correct? But the idea here is that woman is considered to be an important woman. And now let's think of how that would relate to today. So if you say that the reason why a woman shouldn't be a shliach tzibur, for example, is because of kavod hatzibur, now that we say Kol Hanashim, once upon a time, Kol Hanashim Shalanu Nikrot Chashuvot, all our women were considered to be important, but today that's magnified many times. So now why is it that we still say that it's not Kavod HaTzibur, it's not honorable to the community for a woman then of that stature to be a Shliach Tzibur? I'm just trying to understand the contours and the...
It could be that in some areas there are very technical issues. They have to do with women not being obligated in some mitzvot, which might or might not be driven by status. You could think of, meaning it's important to distinguish between sociology and nitty-gritty halacha. To the extent you're asking, why don't women lead Kabbalat Shabbat, so to speak, that might be a totally different conversation than a conversation about why women don't blow shofar. One has to do with the technical parameters of Yatsa Motzi, and one has to do with a matter of Minhag Yisrael. I could see one evolving much faster than the other. Every area needs to be examined to determine whether we're dealing with Kavod HaTzibur, or we're dealing with more technical areas of halacha. It's important not to paint with too broad a brush.
No, but what I find very interesting about your approach, which is why I'm probing where the boundaries of it is, that in this particular approach, where you say precedent isn't so important, it's about going back to the text and see what the texts say. One can actually go back to the text and take a look. What does the text actually say about a certain thing, and has it changed over time? And if this is something which has changed over time, although perhaps there is resistance to that change, but maybe we can change it.
Maybe we can. I wouldn't look askance at a universe in which men and women come to shul and put on a tallis. It's not our practice. That's fine. But when you said to me it became our practice, I wouldn't say, my gosh, that's a community outside of halakha. I would say that's a community that's not yet present in my universe, but it's not a community outside of halakha that women choose to wear tzitzits every day. Maybe that's even a good idea. Not the world we're living in, but it's hard to say that a community in which we're mechanech everybody to do the mitzvah of tzitzis, men and women, is a violation of halakha. I don't think that's the case. You get to ask yourself all the time whether what we have here is an immutable principle or a mutable principle, or a mutable application of a timeless principle.
And would you say perhaps that there are some principles which are immutable, and then there are some which are meant to change as society changes?
And then there's another category. You have to talk very honestly about it. It likes to pretend that it doesn't exist. There are principles that are immutable with applications that are totally socially dependent. The Torah mandates that a man not wear a woman's garment and a woman not wear a man's garment. It's an immutable Torah prohibition. Yet, I always tell people the Torah is missing a vital appendix. There's an appendix needed to the Torah. The appendix that God should have given us is an appendix D, which is a list of all men's garments, next to all women's garments, next to all unigender garments. God left out that appendix in an act of great wisdom. God said there is an immutable Torah prohibition for a man not to wear a woman's garment and the reverse, but the applications of this Torah rule are totally dependent on the norms and the time and the place that you live in. So you have a immutable principle with totally mutable application. I've been tempted to title an article called Moshe Rabbeinu Wore a Dress. But I don't mean it in a flippant way. What I mean is...
It would be considered the dress today.
What I mean is it's following. It is impossible to write a timeless book about Beged Isha or Beged Ish. The book is by definition timeless. The rule is timeless. The book is timely, and that what's a man's garment in 1350 Poland is a woman's garment in 1730. It's a unisex garment in 1950. And then it goes back to being an all man's garment 100 years from now, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
So that's something what you're saying is it's timeless, immutable, but it dependent on what society considers male and female garments. I found really interesting also that you talk about tzniut, because tzniut, this idea of, which is for some reason taken on an extremely important focus within what I would consider to be like orthodoxy today, whereas it wasn't always that case. And you do have lists which people have written about that, which seem now to people have accepted as immutable, but doesn't exist in our sources. What is your view on that?
They're not immutable, and nobody thinks they are. They're intended to provide timely guidance to the community that needs guidance. Without focusing on the lists per se, my view is that every aspect of tzniut is dependent on the norms of the modest men and women around us. And while one can write a book about it, and eventually I will, it is impossible to look at a situation independent of its time and place and say this conduct is immodest. That's what the Pischei Tshuva says explicitly in Siman Chaf Aleph in Even Ezer, and that is the halacha. The works that are written now are designed to provide guidance to those women living in our time and our place, and nothing more and nothing less. Nothing wrong with that. It's even good, but it's not immutable. And these books won't be looked at in 500 years.
It's only some people consider them to be immutable, which is why I mentioned it. And I appreciate you mentioning that they're not immutable. And one would say that perhaps they were those which were written. I'm wondering whether you think it was only really, so the famous, let's just talk about what it is, right? There's a famous book written by a guy called Rabbi Falk from Gateshead, and that was written in the 70s. And the question is that something we should still be looking at, or we should be looking around us?
Now you're asking me about rate of change and time and sociology. I'll leave it for a bigger expert than myself. And then there's this new book by Rabbi Anthony Manning, Reclaiming Dignity, or Dignity Reclaimed. Also a fine book. And eventually I will publish a book arguing that all of tzniut is subjective.
Yeah.
And in every society, in every place, you need a separate book. And to some extent, by the way, this is about the diverse Orthodox community.
Mm-hmm.
As Judaism becomes more monolithic, or with fewer diverse subcommunities, it might be possible to talk about Minhag Yisrael here, rather than Minhag France. But I know in tzniut that this is not the case. Anybody who's been to Europe sees that the religious Jews in France dress more liberally than the religious Jews in Manchester. And the religious Jews in this part of Bnei Brak dress very differently than the religious Jews a mile away in Givat Shmuel, who are just as religious and who learn just as much. And the religious Jews in Gush Etzion dress differently than the religious Jews in Bat Ayin, who dress religiously from the religious Jews in Mea Sharet. And that's fine. To some extent in Israel, by the way, standards of tzniut are somehow determined by a social community that's less present in America, which is a deeply religious Islamic community.
Yep.
You find many more religious women wearing pants in Israel, loose-fitting Muslim pants, than you do in America. And their proof that it's perfectly fine is, look, the modest Muslims who really take tzniut seriously. They take tzniut more seriously than we do. They wear pants. In America, that hasn't yet made inroads. The number of women in Israel, the percentage of our community in Israel where the women cover their hair but wear pants is noticeably higher than it is in America. This is the impact of the Islamic community, where women not only cover their hair, they cover their face, and they wear pants.
To piggyback off that, do you think that the intense focus on tzniut, or female modesty, in Judaism has been perhaps an influence from the Islamic world over the last number of years?
My inclination is not. My operating theory goes as follows. For many years, when you asked an eminent halachic authority these questions, the eminent halachic authority said, look at how the modest non-Jews are dressing, and dress that way. And
may I just ask, that's such an interesting observation. Do you have a source of that observation, from that observation?
Yes, this is what I was told by countless people. I'll send you something on it later. But yes. And all of a sudden, we woke up in the 60s, and you know what we discovered?
That they weren't modest.
No more modest non-Jews.
Right.
And thus we're forced to develop on our own something that we previously, if you'll excuse me to pick a non-Jewish phrase, piggyback off of the non-Jewish society.
So wasn't there such a thing called Das Yehudis? In other words, it was what the modest Jewish women wore? Where did we get
modest Jewish women dressed like the modest non-Jewish women?
Okay.
The real world. That was what the real world looked like. So that when you asked great rabbis in 1950 how to dress in New York, they said, look at how the Catholics go to school, dressed like that.
Mm-hmm.
Now you can't say the word Catholic schoolgirl without having people giggling. And it's not a polite giggle either. And so it's very complicated. My operative theory is that the incessant focus on tzniut starting at the end of the 60s onward has been because the touchstone that we use, which is modest Gentiles, disappeared.
I see.
And this is returned to a re-examination of tzniut in light of the absence of modest non-Jews. This is why most women didn't cover their hair, because most modest non-Jews didn't cover their hair. When Jackie Kennedy went out to her husband, the president's inauguration, she didn't wear a hat, and neither did he. And boy, did that change everything. But by 1970, halachic authorities were looking at the secular world and saying, even though there's much of value in the secular world, the standards of modesty cannot be obeyed, because the secular world isn't seeking to protect the idea that sexuality is a sacred activity only to be engaged in marriage. And thus, I can't look at how the non-Jews dress, because look at how the non-Jews behave.
But you mean even, and that seeped in even to religious non-Jews, such as the Catholics, is what you mentioned.
There aren't any. There aren't any.
Well, you do have the Mormons, which are, for example.
Sure, I guess so. But the Catholics, who were the mainstay of this, there are fewer religious Catholics than there are religious Jews.
Yeah, they're all called lapsed Catholics.
They're all called lapsed Catholics. That's right. There are more religious Jews than religious Catholics in America. It's so fascinating.
So this innovation, I was going to say evolution, but maybe I think the term you like to use is the innovation, which can take place within Jewish law. I want to go back to the Chalav Yisrael for a second, right? Because I find that a really interesting concept, because you see it even in the Rambam, where he talks about, gives an opening for the possibility of being able to drink milk which hasn't been supervised. But that comes to the fore where in, the 1960s or earlier than that, where it's allowed to actually drink.
Earlier, in 1940, everybody was drinking Chalav Stam.
So this idea of Chalav Stam, was that a step change? Would you consider it an innovation, or was that
an innovation mostly driven by a combination of trustworthy government and better technology?
And now you have people who say, if you're really God-fearing, etc., then you should only drink milk which is being supervised by a Jew.
That's not the tradition found among my rebellion, but I guess it's part of one community's tradition. but almost nobody words it anymore as a requirement of Halakha.
So it's really a Kabbalistic concept, right? Which is,
or just something else, a sign of zeal.
a sign of zeal. So this innovation, you think, has now been accepted, because I'm starting to see the opposite happening, right? That acceptance is now being pushed back.
I don't think so at all. I think it's just being socially, some people are getting stricter and some people are getting more lenient. That's fine. You won't find a kashrus agency other than the Star K that doesn't certify Chalav Stam.
Okay, but so from a communal perspective.
Yeah, I think Chalav Stam is normal.
So let's move back to, for a second, you've always had a stream within Judaism. I think for those based Shammai and Beis Hillel, a lenient and a stricter stream within Judaism. The innovations that we're seeing today, part of what the question I asked you is, one of the examples you bring up in that article is, for example, polygamy, which was the outlawing of polygamy was something which was a big innovation.
Change, yes. Maybe the single greatest change in Jewish law in the last 1,000 years.
Was the outlawing of polygamy, you think?
Yes, I think so.
So in order to say that something is prohibited seems to be much easier than to say something is permitted. Whereas you find, like, for the preponderance of Jewish history, or at least of halachic history, you find that koch der Torah adif, right? That, in other words, leniency was considered to be something which was more positive. The innovation seems to be going in the opposite direction nowadays.
There are many ways to achieve leniency. When I was a shul rabbi, I stood up one Shabbos and said, I propose that we agree there's only tefillah b'tzibur when there are both 10 men and 10 women present at daven. Nobody bought debate. Nobody bought debate. There are many ways to achieve equality. Many ways to achieve equality. The aguna problem is a fascinating example of that. Is the goal to allow men and women to get divorced with equal fluidity, or is the goal to restrict a man's divorce in the same way that a woman's divorce is restricted? Both are equal in very different ways.
The question I'm trying to seek here is the innovations which are occurring. It's easier to say, okay, polygamy is not allowed. In other words,
remind me.
I don't know. You tell me.
I don't know. I don't know. You see,
is that a leniency or is it a restriction?
I don't know. Is it a restriction? I don't know.
It's a restriction on how many people a man can marry, for sure.
So it's a chumrah.
In that sense. In which way would it be a kula?
It allows couples without children to stay married to each other. It abolished the obligation upon a couple to get divorced after 10 years of marriage with no children. Every kula, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein likes to say, produces a chumrah, and every chumrah produces a kula. So I don't think I accept the basic framework that you're heading down. The prohibition against polygamy was a change.
Okay.
Whether polygamy is a kula or a chumrah, we could spend some time discussing.
Yep.
But I don't see it as fitting neatly into any of these paradigms. Polygamy is neither a kula nor a chumrah, it's a status. It forced an enormous change in marriage law, for sure.
Okay, I guess the question I'm trying to ask or probe here is that in the case where you have things which have modern society has changed in many ways, and then you would like to go back to the sources and say, given these sources, we should change something. As long as it's, as you say, it's loyal to the sources, we can make these changes. It might be a massive step change, something like disallowing polygamy, but something in today's day and age which might be as significant as that. I don't know what that would be, but something. But the question is, and which would liberalize things tremendously. The question is, like, how does that actually happen? In other words, I understand what you're saying from a perspective of the text, but then there's a whole political aspect to it, which you mention in this article about has to be a Talmud Chacham. it has to go through this process of Talmidei Chachamim have to accept it. And that seems to me like you have a parliamentary process in a sense, which you are advocating there, which would weed out the ability to actually bring halakha, true halakha, right, which is true to the text, in line with what we have today or what's needed for today's generation, because it has to go through this process of approval by some very ephemeral, not clear process, which is a political process.
A little bit different. Sometimes change comes very quickly. That's definitely a description of the process of change used in women's Torah study. The reestablishment of the state of Israel and the governance by a chief rabbinate came much quicker and in a different process. The British ordered it, and it was done.
It was forced, but therefore it circumvented that kind of political kind of process that you're talking about. I just wonder whether we really need that political process. I understand you've written about it and you describe it, but do you really feel that's necessary, or could we do away with that?
Do away with what? The consensus building? Changes that occur by coercion are undone by coercion.
Not coercion, but in other words, there are a number of examples of this. For example, women's minyanim, for example. These are things which there's been, I don't know about recently, but back in the not so long ago, there was a very large controversy about it. And there were a lot of people who are big Talmidei Chachamim who think that is actually, it's perfectly okay to allow that. And there are a bunch of other examples of this as well. Electricity on Shabbat, for example, is another example.
Tell what the process develops. Sometimes Minhag Yisrael develops that there'll be more than one reasonable practice. Sometimes Minhag Yisrael develops around one reasonable practice. As one of my Rebbeim likes to point out, even though there are a variety of theoretical approaches to electricity on Shabbat, you cannot find a community that professes to be halachic that uses electricity on Shabbat.
But I wonder whether that is because of this political aspect that you're talking about.
But you can, in other areas, you can find very diverse minhagim. You can find communities that don't start Shabbat until Rabbeinu Tam's month. But you can't find any community that uses electricity on Shabbat.
There are communities that don't start Shabbat till Rabbeinu Tam's month. I've never come across one.
Okay. I'm not going to comment on the spectrum of your travel. Why should I comment on the spectrum of your travel? What do I know?
But there are some, is what you're saying. I'll accept you at face value.
And
yes.
200 years ago, there were many.
Yeah. Yes, before the God came around.
Live with diversity. Diversity is not the end of the world. Shabbat can begin in this community 45 minutes later than in that community. And other times, uniformity develops. Let me give you an example. Torah reading. We now have uniform Torah reading. Every shul in every place in the whole world reads the same parsha every Shabbat. It wasn't that way 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Could we have different communities reading different things in 500 years? Sure. Would that be good or bad? I have no opinion. Don't confuse uniformity with a permanent sense that the Torah demands uniformity here. There is right now uniformity about Torah reading. There's been Torah reading uniformity for about 700 years. Is that a commitment that there'll be Torah reading uniformity in 700 more years? No.
The question I'm asking here is about this, if you like, parliamentary type approach, which you have to go through in order for it to say, not only does it have to be loyal to the text, but then it has to go through this.
No, it doesn't have to. It's just when it goes through that process, it becomes very well accepted.
I see.
And harder to kick out of the community. Sometimes change occurs unilaterally by dint of one halachic authority.
Right.
And
okay. So,
course of controversy, like when Rabbi Soloveitchik stepped into Stern and gave a Gemara shir. You can say whatever you like about it. The Rav did it, and people said whatever they liked about it. Meaning, you don't have to establish things via consensus. But when you establish things via consensus, they last a long time.
Understood. That's a very important clarification. Thank you for clarifying this. Look, this has been a really interesting conversation for me. And I think to wrap it up, I think the idea that this is not total, there are many aspects of Orthodox Judaism which are not immutable and which can change and will change over time. I think is very comforting to a lot of people who look around and say the way it's practiced today is out of step with perhaps the world around me. And your response to that is,
that's good. Av is the month for comfort. So I'm glad I provided comfort to the people who perceive that the current status quo isn't the way they want it to be. Work for change.
maybe it's not the way it wants it to be. That's taking their desires and putting it on the Torah, which is exactly not what you're talking about. You're talking about it has to come from the text. But a lot of people who say maybe the text doesn't demand the way it's practiced today.
That's true as well. One of Rabbi Lamb's single greatest sayings is communities get the rabbis they deserve. And if you don't like the change, find a rabbi who better aligns with your interests. The fundamental duty a person has is to pick their rabbi. Pick your rabbi wisely. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with saying that to people. Pick your rabbi wisely.
On that wise word, I'm very grateful for your time.
Thank you.